Admiral Tylan had always been a commander who preferred action to words. His reputation among the Xarnak fleet was that of a ruthless tactician, unyielding and unafraid. His victories in countless campaigns had earned him his position as the leader of this armada, feared across the galaxy for his precision and ruthlessness. Yet, as he moved through the quiet, sterile halls of the human colony's research station, he felt an unfamiliar discomfort creep over him. He had been briefed on the mission. The Xarnak were here to oversee the integration of the human population into their new role as subjects, to bend them to their will and make them useful in their expanding empire. Humans had proven troublesome in their past encounters with Xarnak forces, launching sporadic resistance efforts, but Xylan had dismissed them as insignificant. The humans were far too divided, far too disorganized. Their technology was primitive, their tactics laughable. They would fall into line soon enough. But as he passed rows of human workers and soldiers, Xylan noticed something unusual. There was a softness to the colony, an underlying quality that made it seem less like a conquered world and more like a place where people still held on to hope, however misguided. He dismissed the thought quickly. Hope was a luxury that would soon be eradicated. His footfalls echoed as he approached the small room at the edge of the facility. It was quiet here, too quiet. The door to the chamber slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a dimly lit space filled with rows of holographic consoles. His eyes, trained to notice the smallest details, immediately caught sight of the child in the center of the room. A human girl, no older than 10, her face bathed in the soft blue glow of the Starship simulator before her. She was alone. Xylan stepped closer, his alien eyes narrowing. The child didn't seem to notice his presence at first. She was too absorbed in what she was doing, her fingers dancing across the console with quick, deliberate movements. Her face was concentrated, yet not one of panic or uncertainty, but rather a calm focus that surprised him. Children, as he had come to understand, were volatile, distracted creatures. Yet this one seemed different. His sharp ears picked up the quiet hum of the simulator's engine as the display flickered with star charts and enemy ship icons. The child was controlling a massive, detailed starship, navigating it through a simulated battlefield, dodging laser fire and asteroids with eerie precision. Xylan's initial instinct was to scoff. A mere child, playing the game in an insignificant corner of a conquered world. He almost turned to leave, thinking this would be a waste of his time, but something stopped him. The child's movements were too fluid, too practiced. The way she adjusted the ship's trajectory, as if she had done it 1,000 times before, caught Xylan's attention. He lingered just out of view, watching. The child's eyes flicked from the holographic map to the console, her expression never changing, as if she were performing a routine rather than playing a game. Suddenly, the child's fingers flew across the controls in a flurry of rapid movements, and Xylan's interest deepened. The simulation escalated, and with it, the tension in the room. Enemy ships began closing in. The child's starship was outgunned, outnumbered. Xylan could already see the inevitable defeat unfolding. Yet the child didn't hesitate. With calm resolve, she adjusted the ship's systems, rebalanced the power distribution, and ordered evasive maneuvers. Xylan leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. The child's responses were no longer those of someone simply playing a game. They were the precise actions of a commander in the heat of battle. Admiral Tylan remained motionless in the shadows, his gaze fixed on the young human. The battle unfolding on the simulation screen grew more intense, the enemy fleet now closing in from all directions. Tylan could see that the child's starship was outmatched, not by size or weaponry, but by sheer numbers. The holographic display was filled with an array of enemy ships, some massive war vessels and others sleek and nimble, darting in and out of the battle. For a moment, Xylan felt a flicker of disbelief. No child, no matter how gifted, should be capable of commanding a starship with such precision. And yet, as he watched the girl navigate the chaos, He couldn't deny the truth. The child's hands were steady on the controls, her eyes darting between the tactical readouts, her mind already calculating the next move before her fingers even made contact with the keys. Xylan was a veteran of countless campaigns, an expert in every facet of warfare. He knew what it took to command a fleet, the kind of experience and ruthlessness required to survive in the harshest environments. But this was something else. This was a child. A human child, who was maneuvering her ship through the heart of battle as if she had been doing it her entire life. The ship lurched under enemy fire, the screens flashing red, warning of critical damage. Most would have panicked, lost their nerve, but not the child. Without hesitation, she diverted power from non-essential systems to reinforce the shields, managing the damage with a surgeon's touch. The decision was instantaneous. No fear, no second-guessing. The fleet of enemy ships, seeing the human starship's sudden resilience, adjusted their tactics, trying to surround her. Xylan's eyes flickered with a momentary flash of recognition. This was a move the Xarnec fleet had used time and again in their own battles. The pincer maneuver, designed to trap the enemy and crush them from all sides. It was considered a guaranteed victory, a foolproof method for any fleet commander worth their salt. And yet, here was this child, faced with the same trap, and she was reacting differently. With a calmness that made Xylan's chest tighten, the child executed a series of evasive maneuvers, quick, sharp turns, sudden dives, and flawless recalculations of speed and angle. The enemy ships were closing in, but she was already 2 steps ahead. Instead of trying to break free from the trap, she used it to her advantage. Her ship moved like a predator, weaving through the attacking fleet as though she were dancing with the stars themselves. Xylan's breath caught in his throat. The child wasn't just reacting to the situation. She was anticipating it. She was predicting the enemy's every move, staying 1 step ahead, countering with a strategy that Xylan had only ever seen in the highest-ranking commanders of his own people. She initiated a perfect counterattack, targeting the weakest enemy ship and using its destruction as a diversion to cripple the entire formation. In the span of mere moments, the battlefield shifted. The enemy ships, thrown into disarray by the unexpected countermeasure, found themselves vulnerable. The child's starship, battered but alive, darted through the chaos and unleashed a final, devastating salvo that crippled the enemy flagship. Xylan watched, wide-eyed, as the simulation's final sequence unfolded. The enemy fleet, once so confident in their overwhelming numbers, was now scattered and retreating. The child's starship stood victorious, though barely intact. But it wasn't just the victory that left Xylan speechless. It was the way the child had handled the entire battle. Her tactics, her ability to read the battlefield and react accordingly, were far beyond her years. She had outthought them. She had outplayed them. As the simulation's score flashed across the screen, Xylan felt a rare sense of unease settle in his chest. This wasn't just a game. The child had not simply succeeded by luck or chance. She had fought as if she had already faced such battles before. As the simulation ended and the battle music faded away, a quiet silence hung in the air. The child sat back in her chair, her expression unchanging, her hands still on the controls. She looked as if she had just completed a simple task, a matter of routine. But Xylan knew the truth now. This was no ordinary game. This child, this human, had just displayed a depth of strategic brilliance that was far beyond anything he had ever imagined possible. He found himself asking a question he had never considered before. What if humanity isn't the weak species we thought they were? Xylan remained rooted to the spot, unable to tear his gaze away from the young human. The child's focus was absolute, her small hand still poised above the controls as the simulation faded to a final victory screen. The hum of the simulator's engine quieted, but the room itself seemed charged with an electric tension that Xylan couldn't shake. The child's expression remained unreadable, as if the entire battle, lives lost, fleets destroyed, was just another school project to be completed. Her eyes, however, were intense, alive with something that made the Admiral's spine tighten. For a moment, Silent considered leaving. This was, after all, a simple simulation, a child's game. He had seen countless battles in his lifetime, many far more brutal and violent than anything the child had just experienced. His people, the Karnak, had mastered the art of war for eons, crushing civilizations with overwhelming force. But there was something about this human child's calm determination that gnawed at him. Without realizing it, Silent stepped closer, moving soundlessly across the floor. He found himself leaning against the control console, observing the child from just behind. The silence in the room pressed down on him, the sharp contrast between the quiet of the child and the violence displayed on the screen hauntingly stark. His mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle slowly beginning to fall into place. As the child sat there, seemingly unaffected by her own victory, Silent studied her movements more carefully. Her hands were small but nimble, her fingers barely hesitating as they adjusted the ship's power, weapons, and shields. It wasn't just that she had outmaneuvered the enemy. She had anticipated them. Every move she made felt deliberate, calculated. She didn't react to the simulation. She controlled it. The child's expression finally softened as the last remnants of the enemy fleet scattered, their ships flickering out of existence in the simulation. She leaned back in her chair, blinking as though waking from a long, hard day, but there was no sign of joy, no celebration of her success. Instead, there was a deep, focused exhaustion in her eyes, the same exhaustion Silent had seen in many of his own officers after a long, brutal campaign. She wasn't just playing. She was surviving. She was fighting. Silent felt his thoughts turning. This isn't a game to her. The realization hit him with the weight of a gravity well. No child should be able to think like this. No child should be able to command with this kind of clarity. His mind flashed back to his earlier thoughts. Humans had always been underestimates in the Karnak hierarchy. They were small, frail beings with relatively primitive technology. Their greatest asset had been their unpredictable nature, their sheer will to survive. But this was something far more dangerous. The child wasn't just reacting. She was anticipating, thinking ahead, adjusting tactics in real time like a seasoned general. The raw, untapped potential of humanity flashed before him in a way he hadn't considered before. It was as if a dormant power had suddenly woken up. His stomach twisted in an unfamiliar knot. Silent had seen civilizations rise and fall before, but none had displayed this unique form of tactical brilliance. He had fought beings with superior strength, technology, and intellect. But the humans, they fought with something else entirely. Before he could process this new line of thought, the child's voice broke the silence. "Are you just going to stand there, or are you going to play too?" she asked, her tone casual, almost teasing. She hadn't even turned to look at him, as if she assumed he had been there the entire time. Silent blinked, his heart skipping a beat. The child had sensed him, despite his silent approach. It was as if she had known all along he was there, watching, studying. But what unnerved him more was her tone. A child, so innocent in appearance, speaking with the confidence of someone who had already faced far greater challenges than she let on. A rare, almost imperceptible chuckle escaped his lips, more out of disbelief than amusement. "Perhaps," he replied, though the words felt hollow. "Perhaps it's not a game for me." The child finally turned, her gaze meeting his. Her eyes were full of a quiet intensity, a knowing that Silent hadn't expected to find in someone so young. "Maybe not," she said simply, as if the answer were obvious. Then, without another word, she returned her attention to the console. Silent stood there, the weight of her words pressing down on him. As his mind raced, what is this child? What are humans capable of that we don't yet understand? He knew, deep down, that he had just witnessed something far more significant than a child's innocent game. There was something about the way she handled the simulation, about the way she controlled the situation, that made Cylon realize he might be staring at the future of warfare itself, and that terrified him more than any battle he had ever fought. Cylon had watched countless battles unfold, on the front lines, in war rooms, in the cold, vast expanse of space, but nothing compared to what he had just witnessed in this small, dimly lit room. The human child's display of tactical brilliance continued to reverberate in his mind, echoing through his thoughts like the aftershock of a cataclysmic event. He stepped back, unsure of what to do with the mounting sense of unease that gripped him. He was no stranger to fear. It was a natural part of war, a tool to be wielded, a feeling to be embraced by those who understood its value. But this was different. Fear had never tasted like this before. The child's movements were too precise, her choices too calculated. It wasn't the play of a child. It was the execution of a master. He had believed that humanity's strength lay in their unpredictable nature, their sheer will to survive. But now he saw something more dangerous. An intelligence that could learn and adapt faster than any species he had encountered. "Why are you still standing there?" The child's voice cut through his thoughts once again. She wasn't looking at him this time, her attention entirely focused on the controls in front of her. There was an edge to her tone, a strange maturity that made it feel more like a challenge than an innocent question. Cylon hesitated for a moment, his mind still swirling with the implications of what he had just seen. "You're very good at this," he said carefully, his voice betraying none of the awe he felt. He needed to keep his composure, needed to maintain control. The child glanced at him, a brief flicker of amusement passing across her face. "I know," she said matter-of-factly. "I've been practicing." Cylon's brow furrowed. "How long have you been practicing?" "Long enough," she replied with a casual shrug. Her eyes flickered back to the controls as if she were dismissing him, focusing on the next stage of her simulated assault. Cylon stood there, watching, as the child initiated a new mission, a more complex scenario involving multiple opposing factions. As the new simulation began, the stakes were higher. The child's starship now had allies, human ships that would need coordinating, directing. Without hesitation, the girl issued orders to her fleet, telling them to engage the enemy from the flanks, using terrain to their advantage. It was a textbook maneuver, one taught in the most advanced military academies, and yet it was being executed flawlessly by a child who had never seen an actual battle. Cylon found himself leaning forward, unable to stop himself from watching. He had no answers, no understanding of how a child, one so young, could display such mastery of tactics. His eyes darted between the screens, following the simulated ships as they moved across the starfield. He saw the child's starship fire a series of quick, precise bursts at a much larger enemy vessel, forcing it to retreat from its position. The movement was so quick and so calculated that even Cylon, with all his experience, had trouble keeping up. The enemy fleet was on the offensive, but their attacks were sluggish, disjointed. They had underestimated their foe. The child's ship moved with surgical grace, and within moments, the enemy forces were torn apart. The simulation ended once more in victory. Cylon stood frozen, the weight of the situation settling over him like a thick fog. It wasn't just about this single child anymore. It was about humanity as a whole. He had seen what they could do when pushed to the edge, when forced to adapt. This was something far beyond the disorganized, chaotic forces that Tarnak had first encountered. Humanity wasn't just surviving. They were evolving, learning faster than anyone could have predicted. "I could have done that," Cylon muttered, though it was more to himself than to the child. He wasn't sure why he said it, perhaps out of frustration, perhaps to try to regain some sense of control. But the child, ever so focused, didn't acknowledge his comment. Instead, she spoke again, her voice softer this time, almost contemplative. "You're scared, aren't you?" Cylon froze, his eyes widening at the audacity of the statement. This child, this human, was reading him with a precision that rivaled the best tacticians in the galaxy. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. How could a child, so small, so seemingly innocent, understand the fear that had been growing inside him? She wasn't just asking a question. She was stating a fact. Xylan realized then that the child wasn't simply playing a game, nor was she simply a threat that had to be contained. She was a warning. Humanity, as a species, had evolved beyond what he or anyone in the Xarnak Empire could have anticipated. The human race was learning, adapting at a rate that would soon make them unstoppable. The Admiral's chest tightened as the weight of his realization settled in. They had underestimated humanity for far too long. As the simulation ended and the child sat back in her chair, completely at ease, Xylan found himself facing a dilemma that no amount of battle strategy could prepare him for. What did you do when your enemy, your target, was no longer something you could predict or control? What did you do when you realized that the threat wasn't just a single ship or a single fleet? It was a whole species. Xylan had watched countless battles unfold, on the front lines, in war rooms, in the cold, vast expanse of space. But nothing compared to what he had just witnessed in this small, dimly lit room. The human child's display of tactical brilliance continued to reverberate in his mind, echoing through his thoughts like the aftershock of a cataclysmic event. He stepped back, unsure of what to do with the mounting sense of unease that gripped him. He was no stranger to fear. It was a natural part of war, a tool to be wielded, a feeling to be embraced by those who understood its value. But this was different. Fear had never tasted like this before. The child's movements were too precise, her choices too calculated. It wasn't the play of a child, it was the execution of a master. He had believed that humanity's strength lay in their unpredictable nature, their sheer will to survive. But now he saw something more dangerous, an intelligence that could learn and adapt faster than any species he had encountered. "Why are you still standing there?" The child's voice cut through his thoughts once again. She wasn't looking at him this time, her attention entirely focused on the controls in front of her. There was an edge to her tone, a strange maturity that made it feel more like a challenge than an innocent question. Xylan hesitated for a moment, his mind still swirling with the implications of what he had just seen. "You're very good at this," he said carefully, his voice betraying none of the awe he felt. He needed to keep his composure, needed to maintain control. The child glanced at him, a brief flicker of amusement passing across her face. "I know," she said matter-of-factly. "I've been practicing." Xylan's brow furrowed. "How long have you been practicing?" "Long enough," she replied with a casual shrug. Her eyes flickered back to the controls as if she were dismissing him, focusing on the next stage of her simulated assault. Xylan stood there, watching, as the child initiated a new mission, a more complex scenario involving multiple opposing factions. As the new simulation began, the stakes were higher. The child's starship now had allies, human ships that would need coordinating, directing. Without hesitation, the girl issued orders to her fleet, telling them to engage the enemy from the flanks, using terrain to their advantage. It was a textbook maneuver, one taught in the most advanced military academies, and yet it was being executed flawlessly by a child who had never seen an actual battle. Xylan found himself leaning forward, unable to stop himself from watching. He had no answers, no understanding of how a child, one so young, could display such mastery of tactics. His eyes darted between the screens, following the simulated ships as they moved across the starfield. He saw the child's starship fire a series of quick, precise bursts at a much larger enemy vessel, forcing it to retreat from its position. The movement was so quick and so calculated that even Xylan, with all his experience, had trouble keeping up. The enemy fleet was on the offensive, but their attacks were sluggish, disjointed. They had underestimated their foe. The child's ship moved with surgical grace, and within moments, the enemy forces were torn apart. The simulation ended once more in victory. Xylan stood frozen, the weight of the situation settling over him like a thick fog. It wasn't just about this single child anymore. It was about humanity as a whole. He had seen what they could do when pushed to the edge, when forced to adapt. This was something far beyond the disorganized, chaotic forces the Karnak had first encountered. Humanity wasn't just surviving. They were evolving, learning faster than anyone could have predicted. "I could have done that," Kylan muttered, though it was more to himself than to the child. He wasn't sure why he said it, perhaps out of frustration, perhaps to try to regain some sense of control. But the child, ever so focused, didn't acknowledge his comment. Instead, she spoke again, her voice softer this time, almost contemplative. "You're scared, aren't you?" Silent froze, his eyes widening at the audacity of the statement. This child, this human, was reading him with a precision that rivaled the best tacticians in the galaxy. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. How could a child, so small, so seemingly innocent, understand the fear that had been growing inside him? She wasn't just asking a question. She was stating a fact. Xylan realized then that the child wasn't simply playing a game, nor was she simply a threat that had to be contained. She was a warning. Humanity, as a species, had evolved beyond what he or anyone in the Karnak Empire could have anticipated. The human race was learning, adapting at a rate that would soon make them unstoppable. The Admiral's chest tightened as the weight of his realization settled in. They had underestimated humanity for far too long. As the simulation ended and the child sat back in her chair, completely at ease, Kylan found himself facing a dilemma that no amount of battle strategy could prepare him for. What did you do when your enemy, your target, was no longer something you could predict or control? What did you do when you realized that the threat wasn't just a single ship or a single fleet? It was a whole species. Xylan stood motionless, his mind still reeling from the implications of the child's display. He had seen civilizations rise and fall, whole species wiped out by the brutal hand of war, yet nothing had ever unsettled him like this. The realization that he was facing an adversary not just capable of fighting back, but evolving at an alarming rate, was a sobering thought. Humanity wasn't just adapting. They were transcending. The child, no older than 12, had demonstrated something that the most advanced strategists in the Karnak Empire could only dream of: the ability to think several steps ahead, to anticipate moves before they were even made. Xylan's training, his experiences, told him that the ability to predict the enemy's next move was the key to winning any battle. But this child was doing it without effort, as if it was second nature, and that, above all else, terrified him. The simulation had ended again, but Xylan couldn't bring himself to leave. His thoughts were tangled, a knot he couldn't untie. What could the Karnak do against such an evolving enemy? The child? No, humanity itself was not merely a force to reckon with. They were a wild card, a dynamic entity that could shift the rules of the game at will. The child, sensing Xylan's lingering presence, looked up at him with those piercing eyes, her expression unreadable. There was a calm in her gaze, a knowledge that belied her age. She didn't look at him with the arrogance of someone who had just won, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had already seen the future. "Are you still here?" she asked, her voice flat. She didn't seem angry or even curious, just matter-of-fact, as if his presence no longer mattered. Xylan cleared his throat, forcing his thoughts back into focus. You've done something remarkable," he said slowly, his words careful, measured. The child smiled faintly, but it wasn't the smile of a child boasting about a victory. It was the smile of someone who knew the game had only just begun. "I told you, it's not a game. It's how I learn." Xylan blinked, feeling as though he had been struck. "How you learn?" She nodded. "Yeah. Every simulation, every fight. It teaches me something new. I don't just practice tactics. I practice the way people think, the way they react. It's not about winning. It's about understanding." Xylan's heart pounded in his chest. Understanding. The child had said it so simply, but it rang with a deeper truth. It wasn't just the child learning from simulations. It was humanity learning from everything, growing at a pace that could not be measured. There was no longer any clear line between simulation and reality, between games and war. Humanity's thirst for knowledge, their drive to adapt, had transcended what the Xarnak, or any species, had ever encountered. "How many more do you think there are like you?" Dylan asked, his voice hoarse. He had not meant to ask the question, but it slipped from his lips as if the words had been waiting for the right moment to escape. The child didn't hesitate. "I don't know, but I bet there's more. And they're all learning the same way." Xylan's mind raced. If what the child said was true, then humanity had already surpassed the point of no return. This was no isolated incident. There were other children out there, other minds absorbing the same patterns, the same strategies, the same insights. A wave of fear washed over him. Humanity wasn't just growing. They were multiplying their knowledge, creating an entire generation capable of outthinking any adversary. The Admiral turned away from the child, unable to look at her any longer. He paced across the room, trying to collect his thoughts. His fingers twitched involuntarily, as if reaching for a strategy, for a solution to the problem at hand. But there was no clear solution. The rules of war, of conquest, had changed. "We've always had the advantage," Xylan muttered to himself. "Our technology, our tactics, our experience. But you." He looked back at the child, his voice steady despite the storm of realization brewing inside him. "You don't rely on any of those things. You adapt. You learn." The child tilted her head, the faintest spark of curiosity in her eyes. "I told you. It's what we do." Xylan swallowed hard. It wasn't just the child. It was humanity as a whole. And if they were learning this fast, adapting this quickly, then the Xarnak could no longer afford to underestimate them. He had thought of humanity as a species that could be controlled, manipulated, nothing more than a collection of weaklings struggling for survival. But now, as he stood in the presence of this one small child, he saw humanity for what they were, a force in the making, a power that could no longer be ignored. As he walked to the door, Xylan paused and turned back toward the child. This isn't over, is it?" The child didn't answer immediately. She simply stared at him for a long moment, as if she had seen the very future unfold in her mind. Then she smiled again, this time a smile full of quiet, inevitable truth. "No, Admiral," she said softly. "It's just beginning." Xylan's heart sank as he left the room, the door sliding shut behind him with an almost finality he couldn't escape. The galaxy had just shifted, and he knew now that the Xarnak Empire would either have to evolve alongside humanity or be swept away by it. Xylan walked briskly through the long corridors of his flagship, his mind a blur of calculations, strategies, and fears. The child's last words echoed in his ears, repeating in an endless loop. "It's just beginning." He had come here to observe a human child playing a simulation, to gather intelligence, to gauge the strength of a species he had thought to be little more than prey. Instead, he had encountered a truth more unsettling than any battlefield wound. Humanity was no longer just a species to be fought. They were a threat, an unstoppable force on a trajectory that none of them could predict. It was time to prepare. Xylan entered his command center, the heart of the massive warship, where the holographic displays flickered to life as he approached. His officers stood at attention, but they could sense his mood. He did not return their salutes. His mind was elsewhere, caught in the reverberations of the realization that humanity had just crossed an invisible line, the same line that separated the hunter from the hunted. "Admiral, the new fleet maneuvers are ready for review," one of his senior officers said, snapping him from his thoughts. Xylan barely spared him a glance as he walked past the officer, his gaze fixed on the array of tactical data flickering on the central display. "We're not reviewing anything. We need to shift priorities." The officer blinked, confused. "Sir." Xylan spun around to face him, his voice sharp. I don't care about fleet maneuvers. I don't care about military drills. We need to address the new reality. Humanity is evolving faster than we anticipated. They aren't just surviving. They are learning, adapting, and in ways we can't predict. The room fell silent. His officers exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the gravity of the situation. Dylan had always been a leader of unwavering confidence, but now there was a subtle crack in that facade, a crack that revealed his uncertainty, his fear. We underestimated them, he muttered, pacing again. The child. It's not just one. There are hundreds, thousands like her, all learning at an accelerated rate. All of them can think and adapt as quickly as that child did. And they won't stop. A quiet murmur ran through the room. One officer, a seasoned veteran of many campaigns, finally spoke. What do you propose, sir? Dylan stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing as he gazed at the holographic map of the galaxy. We change our approach. We focus on surveillance, on infiltration. We find these children, find their potential commanders, and we control their growth. We can't afford to let them evolve unchecked. Another officer, one who had always believed in brute force, spoke up. We could destroy them, eliminate them before they grow too powerful. Dylan turned on him, his voice cold. That would be a mistake. The child, she showed me what humanity is capable of. If we try to exterminate them outright, they will fight back, and they will learn from it. No, we need to be more subtle. Dylan's mind whirred with the possibilities. His people, the Xarnek, had always relied on overwhelming force, striking first and claiming victory before their enemies had the chance to retaliate. But this was different. Humanity didn't fight the same way. They adapted, learned from each encounter, and in time, they grew stronger. The very strength that had once been their greatest weakness was now their greatest asset. We infiltrate their ranks. Dylan continued, his voice taking on a darker edge. We embed ourselves among them. We turn their leaders, their scientists, their military officers into assets for the Xarnek Empire. We need to break them from the inside before they even know what hit them. The officers nodded slowly, though Dylan could see the wariness in their eyes. None of them truly understood the magnitude of what he was suggesting. None of them had witnessed what he had witnessed. They had never seen the rapid evolution of humanity through the eyes of a single child who had turned what seemed like a harmless simulation into a reflection of a terrifying future. As Dylan continued his plans, his thoughts kept returning to the child's calm, unflinching eyes. The same eyes that had shown no fear, no hesitation. The same eyes that saw the world not as it was, but as it could be. Humanity wasn't just evolving faster. They were becoming more dangerous with every passing moment. Dylan's hands clenched into fists. There was only one thing left to do. He had to move faster than ever before. They had underestimated humanity once, but that mistake would not be repeated. We move quickly, Dylan ordered, his tone hardening. We strike before they can fully realize their potential, and we do it in ways they won't see coming. As the officers began to disperse, preparing for the first steps of the new strategy, Dylan stayed where he was, staring at the star charts. The enemy was no longer just a fleet of ships. They were a new force, one that could not be understood in terms of conventional warfare. This was the future of war. And if Dylan and the Xarnek were to survive, they would need to outthink humanity at every turn. A war of attrition would not work. This would be a battle of wits, a game that humanity had already mastered. And Dylan feared that in this game, the Xarnek Empire might be the ones who would lose. Dylan stood at the observation deck, staring out at the vast expanse of stars before him. His ship, the Xelkar, was already preparing for the next phase of their operation. The silence around him felt suffocating, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him like a storm cloud. He had underestimated humanity. No, the entire species had. And now, everything had changed. The balance of power in the galaxy was shifting, and he was no longer sure which side he was on. The child, she had been the catalyst for this change, the key to unlocking humanity's potential. Since his encounter with her, Xylan had done nothing but replay the simulation in his mind. Her movements, her decisions, had not been those of a naive, inexperienced child. They had been calculated, precise, and as terrifying as any seasoned strategist's. It was as though she understood the game in a way that transcended simple logic. She had seen beyond the immediate steps, beyond the present moment. She had seen the future. He had dismissed her as a fluke, a singular anomaly. But now he knew better. She wasn't alone. And if there were others like her, and there were, humanity was already far ahead of him, already making moves he couldn't predict. "Admiral," a voice interrupted his thoughts. It was the same officer who had spoken to him earlier. "The fleet is ready. The infiltration teams are in position." Xylan turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the officer. "Are you certain they are prepared?" he asked, his voice low. "Yes, sir. Everything is in place," the officer replied, though Xylan could hear the hesitation in his voice. He knew that the officers under his command, though loyal, had their doubts about the new strategy. There was no denying the shift in the atmosphere. Xylan was no longer the confident, unwavering leader they once knew. His uncertainty was palpable, and it had trickled down to everyone. He nodded, pushing the doubt aside. "Then we proceed. Begin the operation." The officer gave a sharp nod and left to relay the orders. Xylan lingered by the observation window for a moment longer. He felt a sense of finality settling in, a feeling that there was no turning back now. The Xarnic Empire's future hung in the balance. Everything would be decided in the coming days, in the coming weeks. As the mission unfolded, Xylan felt the creeping realization that his efforts to manipulate humanity from within, by planting agents and infiltrating key positions, were already beginning to unravel. Humanity had already seen through his plans. It was as if they were always one step ahead. The reports came in, confirming his worst fears. The infiltration teams were being identified and neutralized at an alarming rate. Xylan's spies had been exposed, and humanity's defense networks were locking down with an efficiency he had never seen before. It wasn't just the child's simulation that had been a reflection of what humanity was capable of. It was a mirror of their entire species. They didn't just learn tactics, they adapted to the game itself. They saw the moves long before anyone else. They anticipated. And worst of all, they never, ever underestimated their enemy. The command center buzzed with activity as Xylan's officers scrambled to make sense of the mounting failure. But Xylan stood still, his mind caught in a storm of thoughts, his gut churning. His plan was falling apart, and for the first time in his career, he could feel the crushing weight of defeat closing in. "Admiral," the voice of his tactical officer broke through the tension. "The fleet's movements. They've predicted our next strike. They've already set up defenses." Xylan clenched his fists, the realization dawning on him with a sudden clarity. His enemies were not only capable of fighting back, they were capable of outthinking him. And the galaxy he had once controlled so effortlessly was slipping away. Humanity wasn't just evolving faster. They were rewiring the game, making their own rules, and forcing everyone else to play by them. "We've failed," the officer muttered, looking at the readouts on his console. Xylan didn't answer immediately. He had no response to the words, because in his heart he knew it was true. The Xarnic Empire, with all its power, had made the mistake of thinking they could outblast humanity, when in reality, humanity's greatest weapon was the ability to outthink and outlast them. The child had shown him that. And now, as the fleet stood ready to strike, Xylan realized that the war he thought he had won was never his to begin with. One by one, he began to accept the inevitable. The future belonged to the humans. He turned to his officers, his voice cold and resigned. "Prepare the fleet. We will not retreat, but we will adapt. We will fight this battle on their terms, not ours. But even as the words left his mouth, Phylan knew the truth. The Xarnec Empire had already lost.